Okay, now that we've written a couple different essays in regards to stagnation, sport, accommodation, the roadmap to training, we wanted to get on here for 5 minutes, just very briefly, and talk about spine training. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of give that over to you, Dr. Chivers, and you kind of open up on spine training or lack thereof.
Yeah, I think, to follow up on our initial pieces on Tiger, not knowing the specifics of his full complement of spine training, I think we wanted to just kind of hop on here and talk about what we think might be missing in spine training, considering, the trends of spine exercise as they are right now, maybe some of the earlier trends of what we would have deemed to be core exercise in the last decade or so. And the majority of those exercises, as we see them today, are anti-spine motion training type exercises with the intent of trying to build stiffness in the spine, but the spine as a sort of a rigid cylinder, maybe with the intent of trying to think about the spine as being a what do I want to call it, a power transmitter from the lower legs to the shoulders or vice versa. uh, and I think it is our view that those things might occur obviously in the spine, but the spine is a movable unit. Actually, it's three movable units, four if you include the pelvis, and each one of those movable units has a certain number of smaller movable units segmentally that contribute to that motion. So it's our view that spine training in and of itself should probably be far more specific into the regions of the spine and then the segments of the regions of the spine, the quality of the tissues of the spine, both from a connective tissue perspective as well as a muscle perspective. And I think it's just our view that a lot of that is being glossed over or forgotten about or just not really being fulfilled in any spine training program.
Yeah, so essentially, what you're saying is the spine really isn't getting trained.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably your experience as a clinician and as a athlete consultant, as it is mine, that we've seen that historically, over the last number of years, that the people that come to us with back pain have back pain for a reason, and that is the reason that their spine is not prepared to undergo the things that they are currently doing, or in a lot of cases, these are second, third incidences of low back pain. And if you look back at what was done previously, or you gather information on what was done previously, there was very minimal effort and input into actually making the spine function like a spine should do. And then when you get into the realm of high performance, as we both know, it's usually the same. The spine is treated as sort of a secondary area that isn't worthy of being properly and specifically trained.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we see the injury rates continue to accumulate and climb up there, which is really driving the stagnation, which is one of the things that we've both written about. Now, here's the thing. Okay, we've also made kind of a bold statement in regards to saying that to get out of this stagnation phase or to get out of accommodation, there's only one path. And that path is through, training. In our case, we view treatment and training as the same thing.
Mhm.
So how, like, where, like, what are some things that strength coaches, that therapists, like, what is how can they start to intervene, to start to start to change the trend and to actually start to train the spine?
Yeah, great sort of segue into what I know you would agree with, because it's the view of absolute, that there's there's many things I think that we could chat about, but there's three specific ones that I think are sort of the major leverage points with respect to spine training. The first
When you
would be
mean
to
leverage point, you're saying something that is going to give you kind of some sort of nonlinear amplification.
correct. It may not. When I mean leverage point from a system perspective, I mean the 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 area of the system that you can target that definitely is going to create the biggest change. It's not the easiest change, and it's not the the shortest. It's not. It's going to take a period of time, but yeah, it's going to give you that effect that is then going to affect other things
Hmm.
in a nonlinear way. Uh, and I know you agree with me on this, but let's just kind of name them, and then we can kind of get into a small little detail about each of them. The first is to understand that, as we were talking about before, that when we say lumbar spine, we don't mean lumbar spine as a unit. We mean that the lumbar spine is made up of 5 units. And each of those 5 units has a particular amount of motion in all directions that should occur. And that is governed by the amount of what we would term capsular space available at each one of those vertebrae. The amount of capsular space that exists at a vertebra is going to then lead to, as you put it, nonlinear amplification, or an exponential growth of the potential to acquire more movement, more access to more tissue to be trained, which then can be transitioned into a particular quality that is usable for the athlete. In certain scenarios, if that's golf, that would be a certain amount of power that should be generated at ball impact. If that's an offensive lineman, that would be able to generate force to push someone away. Whatever the case is, all of that can be traced back to the ability to have an amount of usable motion segmentally at each segment of the spine. And that would also include lumbar spine, thoracic spine, cervical spine. So I think that's number one. That is not trained appropriately enough in our current models of training. Number two, which would kind of build off of that, would be understanding that stiffness and the ability to generate stiffness stems from connective tissue. So then training the spine specifically, and this could be done in various hip postures or shoulder postures or pelvic postures, depending upon what your ultimate goals are. Training the connective tissue of the spine to bear load to create that stiffness, which again, I think currently our intent is to do that by not moving the spine. Understanding that you have to move the spine in certain positions via fast movements or slow movements, depending upon the stiffness you want to create, to ultimately create that stiffness. And that stiffness is not going to be created by moving the hips and then hope it transfers to the spine. It actually has to be spine-specific stiffness. So that would be the first part there. And then the second part there is understanding that stiffness isn't going to come via training of the muscle or muscle tissue, that stiffness is going to come via training the connective tissue. And anatomically understanding that the connective tissue of the spine is very dense, it's very broad, there's a lot of it. So there's a lot of different angles and lengths of connective tissue that we have to consider. Again, this could be athlete specific in how we would ultimately build that stiffness. And then the last one that I think is missed in the spine is the understanding that the deeper tissues of the spine, which aren't which I think we would term to be stabilizing tissues, um, in a traditional model, understanding that the physiological quality of those tissues is slow twitch variety. And so sustaining that underlying slow twitch capacity of the spine can amplify, bigger outputs of the spine over greater periods of time, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So again, when you think about spine training, how many times do we see rotational athletes throwing medicine balls against the wall repeatedly, right? Thinking that they're training this, you know, fast twitch or velocity based ability of the spine, but after you know 3 repetitions or 4 repetitions, or they get out into performance. Let's say it's a golfer again, and towards the end of the round, they can't generate that same velocity or that same amount of rotational power. Well, in our view, that would be because they can't sustain an underlying capacity, which should then ultimately give them that capacity for longer periods of time. And that underlying capacity is having that nice base of sustainable, deep tissue ability or quality for long periods of time, which is basically slow twitch training, deep multifidus, deep psoas, quadratus lumborum, all these deeper tissues of the spine, training them effectively to sustain force outputs over time so that we can generate more powerful outputs repeatedly over time. I think is the last thing that would be ultimately missed in current spine training programming.
Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's from our experience, but also our belief that if intervention started to happen at the levels that you're saying, that training is enough to really start to starve off this accommodation, the stagnation. But kind of every majority of people still seem to be kind of chasing their tail, doing the type of training that you alluded to earlier, which isn't really training, the space of the spine, the connective tissue, or the muscle fibers that's needed.
Correct. Correct.
So, so perfect. So we kind of went over the initial mark that we wanted to, but this is essentially the first one that we are doing in regards to video.